Imagine receiving a phone call that changes everything. A voice on the other end of the line saying that the person you cried for, that you searched for tirelessly for almost 3 decades, that you believed was dead, is alive, breathing, walking the streets of a city just 200 kilometers from your home. On March 15th, 2023, the Thompson family lived exactly that impossible moment. Sarah Thompson, who disappeared at 17 years old in September 1995, was found alive at 45 years of age. 28 years later. Almost 3 decades of sleepless nights, of silent birthdays, of hopes that faded away like leaves in autumn. If you are watching this video, please subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Cases like this remind us that truth, no matter how impossible it may seem, sometimes finds its way to the surface after decades buried. What you are about to discover will challenge everything you think you know about disappearances, because when Sarah finally spoke, when she finally explained where she had been during all those lost years, her answer was something that no one, not her family, not the police, not the most experienced investigators, could have imagined. This is a story about impossible choices, about secrets that corrode from within, and about a young woman who simply vanished until the day she decided to return. Sarah Thompson possessed those blue eyes that seemed to hold all the secrets of the world. At 17 years old, in September 1995, she was a young woman of 1 meter 68 centimeters tall, naturally wavy blonde hair that fell to the middle of her back, and a gentle way of speaking that made anyone feel immediately comfortable in her presence. But what really defined Sarah wasn't her angelic appearance. It was her inexplicable passion for helping children. Since she was 14 years old, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she wanted to be an elementary school teacher. It wasn't just an adolescent dream, it was a vocation that consumed every aspect of her life. She spent entire afternoons as a volunteer at the Children's Library in Portland, Oregon, reading stories to small children, creating educational activities, dreaming of the day when she would have her own classroom. Sarah had this natural gift, remembered Margaret Foster, the librarian who supervised her volunteer work. The shyest children would flourish in her presence. It was as if she possessed a secret key to the children's hearts. Sarah's routine followed an almost sacred pattern. Every weekday, she woke up at 6 o'clock in the morning sharp, took a quick shower humming softly, and came down for breakfast with the family. Always cereal with milk and a banana. At 7:15 sharp, she left home carrying her vintage military green backpack, filled with literature books and notebooks where she scribbled ideas for future classes. She was in her senior year at Roosevelt High School, where she was known as a dedicated student, genuinely loved by teachers and classmates. Sarah wasn't popular in the traditional sense of the word, but she possessed something more valuable: the sincere respect of everyone who knew her. She was the type of person who remembered everyone's birthday, who always had an extra pencil to lend, who listened to your problems without judging. Her best friend was Emily Rodriguez, an extroverted young woman who perfectly balanced Sarah's more reserved personality. They spent hours planning their future together. Sarah would become a teacher, Emily would pursue journalism, and they would share an apartment during college. They were simple plans, normal adolescent dreams that seemed absolutely achievable. Sarah had this unique ability to make you believe that everything was possible. Emily remembered years later, her voice still choked with emotion. She saw the best in all people, especially in children that others considered difficult. For her, there were no problem children, only children who needed more love. The Thompson family was the perfect portrait of American middle class in the 90s. Sarah was the eldest daughter, with a younger brother, Lucas, 14 years old, who idolized her in an almost reverential way. Her father, Richard Thompson, worked as an accountant at a construction company, while her mother, Catherine, was a nurse at the local hospital. They weren't rich, but they formed a stable, loving family with solid traditions. Mandatory dinners at 6:30, movie nights on Saturdays, and annual camping vacations on the Oregon coast. Sarah possessed a naturally empathetic personality, but also demonstrated impressive maturity for her age. She was the one who mediated discussions between her parents, who consoled Lucas when he had nightmares, who always knew exactly what to say to make someone feel better. Her teachers described her as an exemplary student with particular talent for English language and child psychology. She had applied to 4 universities with excellent education programs, and her chances of acceptance were practically guaranteed. Her admission essays spoke passionately about her vision of transforming elementary education, of creating environments where every child could flourish. On weekends, Sarah worked part-time at a local daycare called Little Angels Daycare, where she earned money for her future university expenses. The director, Mrs. Williams, constantly praised her dedication and her natural instinct for teaching. Sarah didn't work with children, she explained. She connected with them on a level that I had rarely seen in someone so young. The most crying children would calm down in her arms. It was like magic. At 17 years old, Sarah Thompson seemed to have found her place in the world. She knew who she was, what she wanted, and exactly how to get there. She was daughter, sister, friend, future educator, a young woman with an immense heart and a bright future unfolding before her like a perfectly drawn map. But on the cold afternoon of September 22nd, 1995, Sarah left home for another normal day at school. She never returned, and for 28 years, no one knew why. Until now. Friday, September 22nd, 1995. A day that began like any other autumn day in Portland, Oregon. But that would transform into the longest nightmare the Thompson family could ever imagine. The sky was gray that morning, with that characteristic Pacific Northwest fog that made the temperature drop to an uncomfortable 8 degrees Celsius. The kind of humid cold that penetrates the bones and makes anyone want to stay wrapped in blankets. But Sarah Thompson, as always, was punctual and determined. 6 o'clock in the morning. The alarm clock rang in Sarah's room, as it had every day for the last 3 years. Catherine Thompson, her mother, remembers perfectly hearing the shower turn on at 6:15, followed by Sarah's gentle voice humming an Alanis Morissette song. You Oughta Know had been her personal anthem that year. 6:45 in the morning. Sarah came down to the kitchen wearing her impeccable school uniform. Navy blue plaid skirt, white blouse, gray cardigan, and her favorite black Dr. Martens boots, a 17th birthday present that she practically never took off her feet. Her blonde hair was tied in a loose ponytail, and she carried her military green backpack and a faded denim jacket. "Good morning, Thompson family," she said cheerfully, as she always did, serving herself Cheerios with milk and taking a banana. It was her ritual breakfast, unchanged for years. "Do you have plans for tonight?" asked her mother, Catherine, while preparing sandwiches for Sarah and Lucas's lunch. "Emily and I are going to the movies to see Seven. Dad already said he can pick me up at 10:30, Sarah replied, biting the banana. "And tomorrow I'm going to work at the daycare in the morning." They were simple, normal, completely predictable plans. Nothing that suggested this would be the last breakfast they would share for almost 3 decades. 7:15 in the morning. Sarah kissed her mother on the cheek, ruffled Lucas's hair affectionately, and shouted, "Bye, Dad," to Richard, who was already in the car warming up the engine to go to work. She took her denim jacket and left through the front door, as she did every morning for 4 years. The Thompson house was on Elm Street, 1247, an address that would become sadly famous in the following years. Sarah needed to walk exactly 6 blocks to the bus stop at the corner of Powell Boulevard and 82nd Avenue, where she caught bus number 20 that took her directly to Roosevelt High School. 7:23 in the morning. Mrs. Henderson, the Thompsons' neighbor for more than 10 years, was watering her plants on the porch when she saw Sarah passing by on the sidewalk. She waved to me as she always did, Mrs. Henderson remembers. She smiled that sweet smile and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson." She seemed completely normal. Happy, even. 7:28 in the morning. James Parker, a student from the same school, saw Sarah arriving at the bus stop. She was reading a book, he remembered years later. I think it was something about child education. Sarah was always reading something related to children. And then, emptiness. Bus number 20 arrived at the stop at 7:32 in the morning, as always. The driver, Mr. Rodriguez, said he saw a blonde young woman at the stop, but couldn't be absolutely certain if it was Sarah. There were some children waiting, he explained during the interrogation. Not everyone got on my bus. Some may have taken other lines, or maybe they were picked up by parents. But one thing was certain. Sarah never arrived at school that morning. 8:15 in the morning. First class. English literature with Mr. Matthews. Sarah never missed classes, especially not without warning. When her name was called during roll call and no one answered, Mr. Matthews noted "absent" in his record, but found it strange. 10:30 in the morning. Second absence. Now Emily Rodriguez was worried. She tried to call the Thompson house from the school's payphone, but no one answered. Catherine was working at the hospital, Richard at the EE office, and Lucas at his own school. 12 o'clock. Lunch. Emily was officially alarmed. Sarah would never, ever fail to warn her if she wasn't going to school. They had been best friends for 3 years, shared everything. 3:30, end of the school day. Emily made a decision. She would go directly to the Thompson house. 4:15. Emily arrived at the house on Elm Street and rang the doorbell insistently. No one answered. She walked around the house, peeked through the windows, looked for signs of Sarah. Nothing. 5:45. Catherine Thompson arrived home after her shift at the hospital. She found Emily sitting on the porch, visibly worried. "Mrs. Thompson, Sarah didn't go to school today," Emily said immediately. "No one knows where she is." Catherine felt the blood freeze in her veins. Sarah would never miss school without warning. Never leave Emily worried. Never break a promise or change plans without communicating with the family. 6 o'clock. Richard arrived from work to find Catherine in panic, calling every possible place. Local hospital, police station, school friends, relatives. No one had seen Sarah since morning. 6:30. Lucas arrived from school. "Where is Sarah?" was the first thing he asked, noticing the tension in the air. 7 o'clock. The Thompson family made the decision that would change their lives forever. They called the Portland police to report Sarah Thompson's disappearance. The operator asked if Sarah had a history of running away from home, if there were family problems, if she was using drugs or alcohol. The answer to everything was a definitive no. Sarah was the perfect daughter, the exemplary student, the responsible older sister. She simply wasn't the type of person who disappears. But she had disappeared. And as the hours transformed into an endless night, a terrible truth began to settle in the house on Elm Street. Sarah Thompson had evaporated from the world as if she had never existed. Without leaving clues, without explanations, without goodbyes. The last sign of her had been that cheerful wave to Mrs. Henderson at 7:23 in the morning. After that, nothing but silence. The Portland community's response was immediate and devastating. When news of Sarah Thompson's disappearance spread on the morning of Saturday, September 23rd, something extraordinary happened. The entire city stopped to search for her. Detective Michael Roberts, a 15-year veteran of the EVE Portland Police Department, took on the case at 6 o'clock Saturday morning. He had seen hundreds of missing person cases, but something about Sarah Thompson deeply troubled him. In 90% of missing teenager cases, we find evidence of family problems, drug use, abusive relationships, or at least some indication that the person was considering running away, Roberts explained years later. With Sarah, there was nothing, literally nothing, that suggested she wanted to disappear. Within 24 hours, more than 300 volunteers gathered at Roosevelt High School to organize search groups. Parents, teachers, students, local merchants, even people who had never heard of Sarah Thompson showed up to help. Posters with her photo were spread throughout Portland within hours. The first theory investigated was kidnapping. The bus stop where Sarah was last seen was in a relatively busy area, but there were no security cameras in 1995. Police interviewed every bus driver who passed that route, every merchant in the area, every person who could have been in the area that morning. Nothing. The second theory was voluntary flight, but it quickly crumbled. Sarah hadn't withdrawn money from her bank account. All her clothes were at home. Her favorite books, her jewelry, her work card, everything remained untouched in her room. More importantly, Sarah had left behind her most precious thing, a diary she had kept religiously for 4 years. Catherine Thompson handed the diary to police with trembling hands. If Sarah had planned to leave, she said, she would have taken this. She wrote in it every day. The diary revealed a completely happy and stable young woman. The final entries spoke about excitement regarding university responses, weekend plans with Emily, and normal adolescent concerns about tests and school assignments. There was no indication of depression, family problems, or desire to escape from her life. The third theory was accident. Diving teams searched the Willamette River. Helicopters flew over Forest Park. Sniffer dogs traversed every trail, every isolated area within a 50-kilometer radius of Portland. The search lasted 3 intense weeks and cost more than $200,000. Nothing. The impact on the Thompson family was devastating in a way that words cannot describe. Catherine stopped eating adequately and lost 15 kilograms in a month. Richard developed chronic insomnia and began driving through Portland every night, searching for a daughter who had become a ghost. Lucas, only 14 years old, blamed himself for not protecting his older sister from some indefinable danger. The house became silent, Catherine remembered. Sarah always filled our house with laughter, with her songs, with her stories about the children at the daycare. When she disappeared, it was as if all the joy had been sucked out by the fans. Emily Rodriguez was perhaps the most affected, besides the immediate family. She refused to believe that Sarah had simply disappeared and continued calling the Thompson house every day, asking if there was news. She created a rudimentary website in 1995, one of the first web pages dedicated to a missing person, and maintained contact with private investigators until the 2000s. National media picked up the story quickly. Sarah Thompson became the face of a growing epidemic of missing teenagers in the 90s. Her photo appeared on TV programs, national magazines, and thousands of posters spread across the country. The case generated more than 1,200 leads in the first 6 months, each one meticulously investigated by Portland police. All led nowhere. Detective Roberts worked on the Sarah Thompson case for 4 years before being transferred to another department. In his final notes, he wrote, "This is the most frustrating case of my career. Sarah Thompson didn't run away, wasn't kidnapped that we could determine, and didn't suffer an accident that we could find. She simply disappeared, as if she had been erased from existence." In December 1995, 3 months after the disappearance, the active search was officially suspended. The case remained open, but without new developments, police had to focus their resources on other investigations. The Thompson family refused to give up. They kept the special phone line active, continued distributing flyers, and Richard Thompson spent his retirement savings hiring private investigators. But as 1995 transformed into 1996, and then into 1997, a cruel truth began to establish itself. Sarah Thompson had become one of Oregon's great unsolved mysteries. And for more than 2 decades, it would remain so. Time, they say, heals all wounds. But whoever said that never lived with the inexplicable disappearance of a daughter. For the Thompson family, each day of the next 28 years was a struggle against hope and despair, against the life they needed to continue living and the life that had stopped abruptly on September 22, 1995. The first 5 years were the most brutal. Catherine Thompson developed a disturbing routine. Every morning at 7:15, she would position herself at the living room window and observe the bus stop where Sarah had been seen for the last time. "I kept looking for a familiar silhouette," she confessed years later. For blonde hair swaying in the wind, for that particular way Sarah walked, as if she were dancing. Richard Thompson became an accidental specialist in missing person cases. He corresponded with families throughout the country, participated in support groups, studied statistics with the obsession of an academic. He learned that only 2% of people who disappear without a trace for more than 7 years are found alive. But he clung to that 2% as if it were a lifeline. Lucas Thompson, who was only 14 years old when Sarah disappeared, grew up carrying the ghostly weight of a sister who became more myth than memory. He graduated from high school, went to college, became an engineer, married, had children. An entire life lived under the shadow of an absence. His own children grew up knowing Aunt Sarah only through photographs and stories, as if she were a character from a children's book. Emily Rodriguez kept her friendship with Sarah alive in an almost supernatural way. She became an investigative journalist, partially motivated by her determination to find her best friend. Every year, on the anniversary of the disappearance, Emily wrote articles in local newspapers, keeping Sarah's memory visible to the public. She never married, and would later admit that part of her remained frozen in time, still waiting for the phone to ring with news of Sarah. Over the years, conspiracy theories began to emerge like weeds after rain. Some believed Sarah had been recruited by a religious cult. Others suspected human trafficking. There were those who speculated that she had assumed a new identity to escape some unknown threat. The Internet, as it developed, became fertile ground for these theories, with entire forums dedicated to the Sarah Thompson mystery. In 2005, 10 years after the disappearance, the case gained new attention when a national TV program, Unsolved Mysteries, presented Sarah's story. The dramatic reconstruction showed a blonde young woman walking toward a bus stop and simply vanishing like smoke. The program generated hundreds of new leads, but, as always, none led anywhere. The Thompson family aged around Sarah's absence like a tree growing around a wire fence. In 2010, Catherine was diagnosed with chronic depression and began treatment with medications. Richard developed high blood pressure and diabetes, conditions that doctors partially attributed to prolonged stress. They moved from the house on Elm Street in 2008. "We couldn't bear to pass that bus stop every day anymore," Catherine explained. Lucas married Jennifer White in 2003, a kind woman who embraced the Thompson family and their persistent pain. When their first child was born in 2005, they named him Samuel, Sarah Michael, in honor of the lost sister. It was an attempt to bring something of Sarah back to the world, to ensure she would never be completely forgotten. Emily continued her tireless search, becoming a specialist in missing person cases. She worked with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, helping other families navigate the nightmare she knew intimately. "Every case I solved," she said, "was like a promise to Sarah that I would never stop looking." In 2015, 20 years after the disappearance, Portland police organized a press conference to mark the anniversary. Detective Roberts, now retired, made a public appeal. "If Sarah Thompson is out there, if she can hear this, we want her to know that she is loved and will always be welcome home. And if someone has information about what happened to her, it's never too late to speak." But the years continued passing like pages being turned in a book that no one wanted to read. 2020. The pandemic arrived and brought with it an isolation that the Thompson family knew well. They had been isolated in their pain for decades. 2021. 2022. Catherine Thompson turned 65 and retired from nursing. Richard, at 68, finally stopped driving through Portland's streets looking for a daughter who would now be a middle-aged woman. And then, on a cold morning in March 2023, the phone rang. March 15, 2023, Wednesday, 9:47 in the morning. Catherine Thompson was preparing tea in the kitchen of Vidor, her house in Beaverton, Oregon, when the phone rang. She almost didn't answer. In recent years, most calls were from salespeople or robotic calls, but something made her reach for the phone. "Hello? Mrs. Thompson? This is Detective Jennifer Hall from the Seattle Police Department. Ma'am, I need you to sit down. We believe we have found your daughter." Catherine Thompson's world stopped. Literally stopped. The sound of the clock on the wall, the humming of the refrigerator, even her own breathing, everything ceased for a moment that seemed to last an eternity. This isn't possible," she whispered. "Sarah disappeared 28 years ago." "Yes, ma'am, we are aware. A 45-year-old woman presented herself at the Seattle station last night. She said her name is Sarah Thompson and that she is ready to return home." Catherine dropped the phone. Richard, who was reading the newspaper in the living room, heard the noise and ran to the kitchen to find his wife, collapsing on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. It took 2 hours for the Thompson family to process the information. Frantic calls to Lucas, to Emily, to relatives scattered across the country. Everyone asked the same impossible questions. How? Where had she been? Why now? Is she okay? Detective Hall explained the little she knew. The night before, at 23:15, a woman had walked to the Capitol Hill station in Seattle. She was well-dressed, appeared healthy, and spoke calmly. She told the duty officer that she wanted to report her own discovery, that she had been missing for almost 3 decades and was ready to reconnect with her family. The officers, naturally, were skeptical. People regularly appear at police stations with strange stories, claiming false identities or alleging impossible situations. But when they checked the name Sarah Thompson in the National Missing Persons System, they found the 1995 case still active. The woman provided details that only Sarah Thompson could know. Her parents' full names, the address of the house on Elm Street, the name of her best friend Emily Rodriguez, details about her work at Little Angels Daycare, even information about her military green backpack and her favorite Dr. Martens boots. More convincing still, she had a specific scar on her left ankle, the result of a bicycle accident when she was 12 years old, that was documented in Sarah Thompson's medical records from 1995. "There is no doubt," said Detective Hall. "It's her." Catherine and Richard Thompson drove to Seattle that same afternoon, their hands shaking so much that Lucas insisted on going with them as driver. Emily Rodriguez flew from Portland on a charter plane she financed herself, refusing to wait for a commercial flight. The reunion happened in a small, sterile room at the Seattle station at 17:30 in the afternoon of March 15, 2023. Sarah Thompson, now a 45-year-old woman, with darker blonde hair and some gray strands, gentle wrinkles around her eyes, but unmistakably the same person, stood up when her family entered the room. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that precedes earthquakes. Catherine was the first to move, running across the room to embrace the daughter she had lost 28 years before. "Sarah, Sarah, Sarah," she repeated like a prayer, as if the name could bring back all the lost years. Richard Simpson remained frozen at the door, his hands covering his face, tears streaming between his fingers. Lucas watched in shock, trying to reconcile the teenage sister in his memories with the middle-aged woman before him. Emily, finally, broke the silence. "Where have you been? Please, Sarah, where have you been?" Sarah looked at each of them, with eyes that were familiar and at the same time completely different. There was a gravity in them, a depth that comes only from carrying heavy secrets for a long time. "I know you have questions," she said, her voice lower than it used to be, but still recognizable. "I know you deserve answers, and I am finally ready to give those answers." She paused, looking at her hands. "But first, I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. Not for one day. And I am sorry, deeply sorry, for all the pain I caused." In that small room in Seattle, 28 years of questions would finally find their answers. But the answers, as they would soon discover, were more complex and surprising than any of them could have imagined. The truth, as always, was stranger than any fiction. Sarah Thompson took a deep breath and began to tell a story that no one in the room could have anticipated. "That September morning in 1995, I was at the bus stop, as always. But there was a man there, a man I had never seen before. He was older, maybe 40 years old, well-dressed. He told me that my mother had suffered a terrible accident at the EO hospital and that he was there to take me to her." Catherine gasped. "But I never—" "I know, Mom. I know you never had any accident. But at that moment, I was a 17-year-old teenager in panic. He knew details about our family, about where you worked. He said there was no time for verifications, that we needed to go immediately." Sarah paused, tears finally beginning to stream down her face. "He took me to a van, and when I realized something was terribly wrong, it was already too late." What followed was a story of kidnapping, of a young woman held captive for 2 years by a man named David Miller. a name they later discovered to be false. Sarah was kept in an isolated cabin in the Washington Mountains, far from any civilization. "He never hurt me physically," Sarah explained, her voice tremulous but determined. "But he told me repeatedly that my family had given up looking for me, that you had moved on and moved forward. He showed me fabricated newspapers, false articles, saying that the search had been ended. After 2 years, David Miller died of a sudden heart attack. Sarah, then 19 years old, found herself free but completely lost. She had spent 2 years believing that her family no longer wanted her. I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid that you really had moved on. Afraid that there was no longer a place for me at home. So I built a new life." Sarah assumed a false identity and spent the next 26 years living as Lisa Patterson in small towns throughout the American West. She worked as a babysitter, as a nursing assistant, always helping children and families, never being able to completely escape her true nature. "But the guilt never left me," she concluded. "Every day for the last 28 years, I thought about you. And finally, I realized I needed to know the truth. I needed to find out if you still cared." She looked at her family through her tears. "And now I know that you always cared." Today, Sarah Thompson is rebuilding her life alongside the family that never stopped loving her. The process is slow, complicated, full of pain and simultaneous healing. But for the first time in almost 3 decades, the Thompson family is complete again. Some wounds of time really can be healed. Sometimes, against all odds, the lost can find their way home.